Composting is the natural decomposition of organic material into a nutrient-rich soil amendment called compost. There are many different ways to compost. The method that I have chosen is by buying a big black plastic container. And the reason I chose this method is because it was the cheapest. My 240 litre composting bin was only about $45. My particular composting bin, you normally put on the soil, and it has these pins that you can stick into the ground. I have to put mine on concrete. So to begin with, what I wanted to do was to create a false bottom, because otherwise the pins that normally stick into the ground would leave a open layer, and if I immediately started adding food scraps, then these would fall out the bottom, attracting the likes of rats. So I want to create this false bottom, and I initially stabbed holes into my cardboard to fit these legs into. After about half an hour, I realized that I was an idiot, and I could just fold up my pieces of cardboard and place them directly into the bottom of my compost container. What I then did was add in some pre-made compost mix to level out and finish off my false bottom. As I said, composting is the natural decomposition of organic material into the nutrient-rich soil amendment, which we call compost. The breaking down of the organic material is into its most simple components, and we define these based on the presence of carbon and nitrogen. And the reason we do that is because carbon and nitrogen are two of the most simple building blocks required for living things. Now, our DNA and the DNA of every living thing on Earth contains a nitrogenous base and a 5-carbon ring. So carbon and nitrogen are essential for the creation of DNA and therefore the building blocks of life. And when you're establishing or even maintaining a compost bin, you need to be conscious of the amount of carbon-rich and nitrogen-rich additives or components that you're adding to your compost mix. And so the simple way to think of it is you want a 2-to-1 of 2 carbon to 1 nitrogen ratio. And you can think of material that lacks water, like cardboard or dried out grass clippings or dried out sticks. Those can be thought of as being a carbon-rich additive. Comparatively, your food waste and fresh grass clippings, those that still contain a lot of water, can be thought of as nitrogen-rich. So you need to add in aim for a 2 carbon to 1 nitrogen ratio. The actual science of how composting works is it utilizes microorganisms that are everywhere. How it works is these microorganisms, like bacteria, they essentially eat your organic material and break it down. And in order for compost to work effectively and to maintain your compost, you need to have a basic understanding of how microorganisms work. So what microorganisms want is you need to think about their optimum conditions, and these need to be a warm, dark, moist, and aerated environment. So the black plastic container is good because it absorbs the sunlight, therefore making a warm environment, whilst also reducing the amount of actual light exposure that the compost heap has, ensuring that it remains dark. You also need to water your compost bin in order to keep it moist, because the microorganisms like to have a moist environment. Now, the final one is ensuring that your compost heap is aerated. How the microorganisms break down your material is through the process of respiration. And there's 2 different types of respiration, aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration uses oxygen, and it is the type of respiration that you're wanting the microorganisms to perform when breaking down the material in your compost bin. If you do not aerate your compost bin and your microorganisms do not receive oxygen and switch to anaerobic respiration, this can produce byproducts like lactic acid. Just like we produce when doing exercise, the lactic acid causes the cramps in your legs. Just like when you're making kimchi, you want the microorganisms to undergo anaerobic respiration because it produces lactic acid, giving the kimchi the sour taste. However, with your compost heap, if the microorganisms switch to anaerobic respiration, what happens is that the lactic acid can be built up, and that gives it a ammonia-like smell and causes your compost heap to smell. How you can aerate your compost is by just taking a pitchfork and mixing it all around to ensure that adequate oxygen reaches all of the parts inside your compost bin. Another thing that you can do to ensure that your compost heap doesn't smell is the ratio of 2:1 of the carbon to nitrogen, so the browns to the greens, is brown material breaks down a lot slower, which isn't surprising because it lacks that water content, and microorganisms like to be in a moist environment, so it's not as favorable conditions for them to grow on and to break down the material. So if your compost heap is starting to smell, that can be because of rotting, and you want to slow down the decomposition rate, and you can do this by increasing the amount of brown material. And inverse to that, if your compost heap just isn't, or your organic material isn't breaking down fast enough, you can add in more green material or nitrogen-rich material, and this will cause the microorganisms to work faster and to break down your material at a quicker rate. You're gonna have to hear me out for this one. I've been thinking about the idea of photosynthesis, and it doesn't sound real. What it sounds like is you've been hanging out with your mate all day, and they're just saying stupid shit. And they ask you, they're like, what do plants eat, man? And you're like, dude, I don't know. Like, they eat the sun, man. I don't fucking know, man. Shut up. And then everyone just kind of rolled with that forever. Like, yeah, plants eat the sun. Like, if I told you that I went to space and I met these aliens that could live like 1,000 years old, and they can make more of themselves when part of them falls off, they can grow another one of themselves. They're brown, but their hair is completely green, and instead of eating, they absorb energy from a burning ball of gas that's millions of miles away. You'd think that this is the coolest alien ever. But it's just a tree. And the more you think about this process of photosynthesis, it just becomes more and more mind-boggling. And, I think people, you say, you think there's aliens in outer space, look in the ocean. No, look around you. Like, what is a tree? What? It's just... The more time I've spent thinking about nature and plants, consistently, my mind is just perplexed. I find it so unfathomable how much complexity there is in such simplicity. It's truly beautiful. Damn. Well, that's the video. If you've watched this long, then you obviously love to hear me yap, which is quite impressive. Here is my veggie garden from the start, like when I first started making this video. And then about a month, maybe 6 weeks later, this is where we are, so it's looking pretty good. I've enjoyed making this video. And yeah, thanks for watching.